That was the discovery, during the last week of the field season, of the first cache of startling plaster statues and busts that had been buried on site some 9,000 years ago.
In a Siberian peat bog, a carved wooden face is pulled from the mud, and it turns out to be 12,000 years old, older than every pyramid ever built. It should not exist, yet it does, and it is not alone. All over the world, the ground keeps giving up things that were never supposed to be possible. Objects too old, too precise, or found in places they could never have reached. Every one of them is real, everyone has been studied for decades, and everyone still defies explanation. These are the most impossible ancient discoveries ever unearthed. The face in the bog. It was 1890 when workers cutting peat in the Ural Mountains first pulled those fragments of carved wood out of the wet ground, not yet knowing what they held. Once the pieces were cleaned and fitted back together, they revealed a single towering figure carved from one enormous tree, the Shigir idol, standing more than 5 meters tall, roughly the height of a 2-story building. Its surface is covered in deliberate geometry, straight lines, zigzags, and repeating patterns running the whole length of its body, and stacked vertically down its front are 7 human faces, calm and unreadable. The first dating put it around 9,000 years old. Later, analysis pushed it past 12,000, twice the age of Stonehenge, and thousands of years older than the first pyramid. Picture that for a second. It was carved while the last ice age was still loosening its grip, and the first forests were only beginning to spread across Eurasia. And that is the part that should not sit easily with you. The people who made it were hunter-gatherers, the kind we usually imagine living small, hard lives fixed entirely on survival. Yet every line on that idol was planned. The faces and the motifs suggest a story, a myth, a cosmology, maybe even a warning, carried through a tradition of craftsmanship refined over generations. The tree was at least 150 years old when it was felled, stripped, and shaped with nothing but stone tools, then raised upright to loom over a landscape that held almost nothing else on this scale. What the carvings actually meant is still locked inside the wood. Some read the idol as a map of a layered universe, sky, earth, and underworld. Others see ancestral spirits, or a boundary marker for sacred ground. The zigzags and parallel lines echo motifs found across early Eurasian art, hinting at a shared symbolic language among peoples separated by enormous distances. And yet, there is nothing left to translate it against. No inscription, no key. It survived at all only because the airless bog sealed it away for over 10,000 years. And those 7 faces are not the last set that would come out of the ground with no one able to say what they were for, because on the far side of the world, another group of them had been hidden, and hidden on purpose. The buried statues of Ayn Ghazal. In 1983, on the outskirts of Amman in Jordan, a highway crew cutting into a hillside sliced straight through the edge of a site called Ayn Ghazal, the Spring of the Gazelle, one of the largest settlements of the entire Neolithic world. When archaeologists came in behind them and began clearing the collapsed walls, they found something no one had prepared them for. Caches of life-sized human statues laid carefully into pits beneath the floors of the houses. They were built from bundles of reeds coated in lime plaster, modeled into human shape, standing around a meter tall. Long, slender necks, narrow bodies, hands pressed flat to their sides, and enormous dark eyes outlined in bitumen. A few of them had 2 heads sharing a single torso. They date to somewhere between roughly 7250 and 6500 BC, which makes them some of the oldest large-scale images of the human form ever created, shaped thousands of years before anyone on Earth had invented writing. And the effort behind them is almost hard to believe. Lime plaster meant heating limestone past 800 degrees, burning through enormous quantities of scarce wood in a dry, unforgiving landscape. To pour that much of everything you had into making art meant the act carried real weight. And then, almost as soon as each figure was finished, it was buried, made for a single ceremony, used once, and sealed away where it was never meant to be seen again. Nobody knows who they were meant to be. Ancestors kept close inside the home. Gods, protective spirits. The people of this same region also preserved human skulls, plastered over and separated from their skeletons, which hints at a belief that the dead never entirely left the world of the living. So maybe the statues were the dead, given faces and made to stay. But without a single written word to go on, the meaning stays just out of reach, black-eyed and silent for 9,000 years. And if faces hidden in the earth unsettle you, wait until you meet the ones that were never buried at all, the ones staring out of a mountainside 4,000 meters above the sea. Before we go any further, if this is the kind of thing that keeps you up at night, do yourself a favor and subscribe. We go this deep into the ancient world every single week, and there are stranger things ahead than a bog idol and a pit full of buried faces. Trust me, you do not want to miss what is coming. The faces of Martzahuasi. High in the Andes east of Lima, more than 4,000 meters up, there is a barren plateau called Marcahuasi that has been quietly unnerving people for decades. Scattered across its exposed rock are formations that seem to take on shapes they have no business taking. Human profiles, animals, whole faces gazing out from the cliffs. The most famous of them, the one people call the Monument to Humanity, appears to show several human faces looking in different directions from a single wall of stone. And the question that has never gone away is a simple one. Is any of this the work of human hands, or is it all a trick of stone and light? The plateau is made of soft volcanic tuff, the kind of rock that wind and water carve into strange forms over millions of years. Geologists have a plain word for the rest of it: pareidolia, the mind's habit of finding faces where there are none. Under a direct sun, the profiles sharpen into something that looks almost deliberate: jaw, brow, the hollow of an eye. Then a cloud slides across the light, and in a moment, they dissolve back into bare rock, as if the mountain had decided to hide them from you again. In the 1950s, a Peruvian explorer named Daniel Russo climbed up onto that plateau with his cameras and could not let it go, photographing and naming dozens of the forms, convinced they were sculptures left behind by a civilization older than any known culture of the Andes. Most scholars disagreed with him then, and most still do. But the plateau is not empty of people. Stone ruins, terraces, tombs, and pottery fragments show that communities lived and held rituals up here long before the Inca. The Yauyos culture built settlements and terraces on the slopes below, and for them, this high, thin-aired place may have been a site of pilgrimage, chosen precisely because the rocks already seemed to wear faces. If ancient people looked at those shapes and saw the spirits they believed lived in the mountains, then even a few small carvings could have deepened the illusion. Thousands of years of erosion have since erased any clean line between what nature shaped and what a human hand touched. And that blurring, that impossible-to-settle question of nature against intention, turns out to be exactly the problem waiting downriver in Egypt, where something buried beneath one of its very first cities was no illusion at all: the flood beneath Egypt. At a place the ancient Egyptians called Nekin, archaeologists dug down into the foundations of Egypt itself and found, buried beneath them, the scars of a disaster. We know the site today as Hierakonpolis, and it flourished more than 5,000 years ago, before the pharaohs, before the pyramids, before Egypt was even a single kingdom. It grew into one of the largest cities of its age, and it was here, in its temple ground, that the Narmer palette was found, the carved slab that shows the unification of Egypt under one ruler. But underneath the houses and the temples lay something else. Thick layers of silt and clay shot through with smashed pottery and collapsed walls, the unmistakable signature of a sudden, violent flood. Not the gentle annual rise of the Nile that renewed the fields every year. This was far beyond the normal floodline, deep enough to bury the riverbank houses, tilt their walls, and seal entire workshop floors under fine mud. In places, kilns still full of half-fired pottery lay trapped beneath the flood layer, as if the potters had simply dropped everything and run. There was no sign of any careful burial, only ordinary objects caught mid-task and locked, in the mud where they fell. The cause is still uncertain. Maybe extreme rainfall far upstream, maybe a shift in the river's course during a stretch of unstable climate near the end of the 4th millennium BC. What the water left behind was a frozen moment from the very dawn of Egyptian civilization. Tools and food and pottery caught exactly where they sat when it arrived. When the city was finally rebuilt, it climbed to higher ground, its temples set safely above the high water mark, as though the survivors had learned a lesson they never wrote down. A civilization that would one day build its entire creation myth around dry land, rising out of the waters of chaos, may have taken that story, in part, from a real flood. And water was not the only thing that came down out of nowhere and burned itself into a people's memory, because far to the south, in the cloud forests of Peru, something crossed the sky. The flame, over the clouds. High in those cloud forests of northern Peru lived a people the Inca would later call the warriors of the clouds, the Chachapoya, who built stone cities and cliff tombs along ridges that spent half their lives lost in mist. Their fortress at Cuilap is so vast it is sometimes called the Machu Picchu of the north. But threaded through the accounts of this remote culture is something that does not belong to ordinary archaeology at all: the memory of a flame in the sky. The Chachapoya flourished from around 800 AD until the Inca finally conquered them in the 15th century, and the Spanish chroniclers who arrived afterward wrote down stories the people still carried by mouth. One of them told of a great fire crossing the heavens, an object that lit the night, filled the air with a roar, and, in some versions, came down somewhere in the mountains. It was remembered vividly enough to survive generations, passed from parent to child around the fire, told not as a distant myth, but as something their own ancestors had watched happen with their own eyes. So, what was it? The most likely answer is a bolide, a meteor big enough to explode in the atmosphere and throw off a fireball in a shockwave. Events like the 1908 blast over Tunguska or the 2013 fireball over Chelyabinsk show how terrifying that can be, even now, with all our instruments and explanations. So, to people who had none, a fire lighting up the whole sky would become a story told for centuries. A bright comet hanging overhead for weeks could have done the same. What makes the Chachapoya account so rare is not any certainty about the cause. It is that it was written down as a remembered event rather than a legend. And a disappearance is one thing when it happens in the sky. It is another thing entirely when the thing that vanishes is an entire Roman army, and no one can agree on where it went. The legend that vanished? Rome kept meticulous records. It carved its victories into stone, and it wrote its defeats into history, even the humiliating ones, which is exactly why this next silence is so strange, because somewhere in Roman Britain, an entire legion of thousands of men slipped out of the record and was never explained. The Ninth Legion, the Hispana, simply stopped appearing. The Ninth had a long and bloody pedigree, likely raised under Julius Caesar himself, fighting through the civil wars and earning the name Hispana in Spain. By the 1st century AD, it was in Britain, in the thick of the brutal campaigns to hold the island. During Boudicca's revolt in AD 60 or 61, it marched to relieve the settlement at Camulodunum, the place we call Colchester, and was ambushed on the way, its infantry cut to pieces, only the cavalry escaping. It was rebuilt and posted to York, then known as Eboracum, where inscriptions and stamped tiles confirm it was still there into the early 2nd century. And then, around AD 120, the mentions just stop. Other British legions keep turning up in the record, the Ninth does not. One theory has it wiped out by northern tribes in Scotland, an idea a famous novel later turned into legend. But if a whole legion had been annihilated, Rome's historians, the same ones who wrote at length about the catastrophe at Teutoburg Forest, would almost certainly have said so. Another theory follows a single stamped tile found at Nijmegen in the Netherlands, hinting the legion was quietly moved to the continent and lost later somewhere in the east, perhaps in the revolts in Judea. Others think it was simply disbanded, its survivors folded into other units. The honest answer is that nobody knows. A legion of thousands that once helped hold the empire's northern edge vanished from history and left a silence as loud as anything it ever did. And a vanished army, at least, leaves a hole where it used to be. What do you do with the opposite problem? An object that turns up somewhere it could not possibly belong. The Roman face in Mexico. This last one is a single object, no bigger than your fist, and it may be the most stubborn of all of them. In the 1930s, in the highlands of central Mexico near Toluca, a grave was opened at a pre-Columbian settlement called Tecaxic Calixtlahuaca. Inside were exactly the things you would expect: pottery, copper bells, turquoise beads, all firmly dated to the centuries before any Europeans set foot in the Americas. And sitting among them was something that had no business being there at all: a small terracotta head of a bearded man, his features sharp and distinctly not American. In 1933, a Mexican archaeologist named Jose Garcia Payon was the one working that site. and he cataloged the head with the rest of the grave goods and moved on. For decades, almost no one looked twice at it. But that head looked Mediterranean, Roman, or Hellenistic. The kind of small figurine produced across the ancient Old World more than 1,000 years earlier and half a planet away. No known Mesoamerican culture ever portrayed bearded men with realistic proportions. Across the whole region, faces were stylized and hairless. And that one detail, the beard, was enough to convince a lot of people the thing simply could not have been made in the Americas. In the 1990s, scientists ran thermoluminescence testing at the Max Planck Institute to find out when the clay was last fired. The result confirmed it was genuinely ancient, but it could not say where the clay had come from, and it matched neither central Mexico nor any known Mediterranean source. The burial itself showed no sign of disturbance, the head sealed in place when the grave was first closed, right alongside offerings dated to the 14th or 15th century. Skeptics point out, fairly, that a few simple features can resemble Roman work by pure chance, and that one lonely object cannot rewrite history on its own. And yet, it refuses to sit quietly in any box we have. Either a Mediterranean object crossed an entire ocean more than 1,000 years before Columbus, or someone in that valley carved a face in a style that should have been impossible for them to know. No inscription marks its surface, no record explains its journey, just a small clay face with a beard, staring up out of Mexican soil, and nothing left to tell us how it got there. So that is where we leave it tonight. 7 discoveries that still refuse to fit, sitting in the ground like quiet arguments against everything we thought we knew. Now it is your turn. Out of all of them, which one do you think has a real explanation still waiting to be found? And which one do you believe will never be solved? Tell me down in the comments because I read them. And if nights like this are exactly what you came for, subscribe and stay curious because there is always another mystery waiting in the dark.